Today, we're diving into a constitutional crisis that reveals the complex dynamics between cultural identity, democratic governance, and coalition politics in New Zealand. Most of us think of New Zealand as progressive beacon for indigenous rights, a model that other settler societies aspire to follow. Imagine a story that connects seemingly separate words, 50 years of judicial interpretation, a 21st century political power grab, and a century-old treaty that still define a nation's identity. Our guest today is Dr. Carwyn Jones, honorary adjunct professor at Victoria University of Wellington School of Maori Studies, brings unprecedented insight into how democratic institutions can both protect and threaten indigenous rights. Numbers tells a remarkable story. Nearly 300,000 public submission, more than triple any previous bill that largest march on parliament in New Zealand history, and unprecedented 21-day suspensions recommended for MPs who perform a haka in the House of Democracy. This isn't just a New Zealand story, it's a narrative about how quickly constitutional protection can unravel, how settler society grapple with decolonization, and what happens when political opportunism meets fundamental question of justice. We'll explore how coalition agreements, parliamentary procedures, and cultural expressions intersect in ways that reveal deeper tension about equality versus equity, judicial activism versus democratic sovereignty, and the international implication for indigenous movement worldwide. From the windswept corridors of Parliament House to indigenous community across the globe watching with growing concern, this controversy exposes the sterling vulnerability of rights many assume were permanently protected. Stay with us as we unravel this compelling narrative of constitutional crisis and cultural resistance. Good day, Dr. Carwyn Jones, honorary adjunct professor, School of Maori Studies at Victoria University of Wellington. How are you today?
I'm very good, thank you.
Thank you for your time, Dr. Jones. My first question to you, Dr. Jones, is the treaty principle bills aim to legally define the principle that have been historically been developed through court interpretation. What are the constitutional implication of shifting this interpretive authority from the judiciary to parliament, and how does this reflect broader tension about democratic governance versus judicial activism?
Yes, so the Treaty Principles Bill would have been quite a shift in that respect. So the situation that we've had up until now is that for 50 years, the Waitangi Tribunal has been the body to hear claims based on this idea of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi and determine the interpretation of those principles and to make recommendations for how they should be applied. And then we've also seen the other courts, the ordinary courts, also have a role in this. The Waitangi Tribunal is not really a court, it's a commission of inquiry, so it's a little bit different, and it doesn't have the same kind of binding powers that a court does. But when the tribunal was set up in 1975, the government, the Parliament, used this language of the principles of the treaty. It didn't define what those principles were, and it seems pretty clear that the intention was that it didn't have a particular list of principles in mind,
Mm-hmm.
but rather it was a kind of guide to the Waitangi Tribunal to say, when you're interpreting the Treaty of Waitangi, we want you to look not just at the kind of black and white text of the words, but we want you to take into account the context and the circumstances. We want you to think about the Māori language text and the English language text, and we want you to think about how that's going to apply in our society today. Not just think about what it means in 1840, but actually what it means as we continue to face new circumstances and challenges. And so that was the intention, and the tribunal has done that over 50 years, built up this huge body of work so that we have some standard principles that we refer to now around partnership, active protection, and so forth. And for the Parliament to then say, no, we don't want those principles, we're going to set a different set of principles, would have been, throwing out kind of 50 years of understanding that Māori and the government had built up about how the treaty was going to work, and would have really put us back to starting again, thinking about, well, what do these new principles mean? How are they going to apply? And would have created a whole lot of uncertainty in that respect.
So the ACT party argued that undefined treaty principle have allowed court to justify action contrary to equal rights. How do you assess this critique of judicial developments of constitutional principles, and what does it reveal about New Zealand's unique approach to indigenous right within a Westminster system?
Yes, so one of the concerns really about the way in which the Treaty Principles Bill was set out was this very kind of formalistic idea of what equal under the law meant. And so it was very much the approach of, well, everyone just ought to be treated the same, kind of regardless of circumstance, and certainly regardless of whether, for example, land had been taken in breach of treaty principles, which had led to a whole lot of economic disparities, which we still know about today. And, really, when we think about what is actually required to be equal and have equal rights recognized, as we should be looking at much more of a sense of delivering equitable outcomes. And so, for Māori, we have uh, you know, in a whole range of socioeconomic indicators, uh, Maori fare very poorly. We don't have as good a health outcomes as other New Zealanders, and that's across a whole range of different socioeconomic groups, actually. So consistently across socioeconomic groups, Maori have disproportionately worse health outcomes, and so really. What the Waitangi Tribunal would say through the application of treaty principles is that you ought to be developing policy which addresses those inequities. And the ACT Party was pushing a view of saying, no, everybody just needs to be treated the same. That's a kind of principle that uh, we know that all the international human rights literature and mechanisms through the United Nations, for example, and through most of our law takes into account and says actually we need to take account of the disparities that exist and the different circumstances people were in thinking about the way in which we develop law and policy.
That's going to be interesting to look at it. So, given that the Treaty of Waitangi itself isn't enshrined in law, but its in principle has been woven into legislative over time, how sustainable is this evolutionary approach compared to more formal constitutional enrichment?
Yes, well, I think one of the things we're seeing with this current government certainly is um, that those rights under Te Tiriti, under the Treaty of Waitangi, are not well protected. They are very fragile and vulnerable to a government like this one, which is sort of intent on removing Maori rights and input into a whole lot of areas. Up until this, for the last gee, 40 or so years at least, probably, we've come to expect the New Zealand governments, even though some might be more conservative than others, but that they're sort of a commitment to progressive realization of those rights under Te Tiriti. And this government we've seen was wanting to take us really back 50 years. And it's become very clear that those rights under the treaty are quite vulnerable. And I think a more formalized recognition through protected constitutional rights, would actually be very beneficial in lots of ways.
Thank you for that, Dr. Jones. So, the bill created an unusual situation where coalition partners, that's National and NC First, publicly opposed their junior partner's flagship legislation. What does this tell us about the dynamics of coalition governance and the management of ideological diverse partnership?
Yes, so this was quite it was a slightly unusual part of the coalition agreement whereby the National Party had agreed uh, that this ACT Party policy of the Treaty Principles Bill would be introduced to Parliament. The National Party would support it at first reading, so it would get government support at its first reading. It would go to a select committee. There'd be an opportunity for public submissions, but there was no commitment from the government as a whole, the coalition government, to actually enact that piece of legislation or take it any further than that. Now, one of the things that I think was quite disappointing about all of this was that it did mean that there was a lot of time and energy tied up in responding to a bill which ultimately was likely to go nowhere. But I think the demonstration of political opposition to it was really important to ensure that that was the case. But also, it was, I think, a really divisive moment because it did it was a bill which was intended to be divisive, and the having the public submission process, while overwhelmingly submissions were in opposition to the bill, it did create a platform, I think, as well for others who were in support of the bill, for what I think were generally pretty racist reasons. I don't think there's any getting away from that fact, and it allowed them a platform as well. And I think that's partly what the ACT Party wanted. So I think it was it's disappointing that the government, that the National Party agreed to that in the coalition agreement, even though it wasn't going to pass. Whereas they could have just said, no, we're not entertaining that idea at all. And it does raise questions about uh, the way in which our coalition governments work. We have a proportional representation system, so we usually, under that system, have had coalition governments of some form. And I guess it really does rely on the majority party in that coalition being prepared to exercise its strength as the majority party, and to really put a stop to these quite fringe policies that are being proposed by their junior coalition partners.
Mhm. I remember even Prime Minister Lawson called the bill divisive while remaining in coalition with its proponent. How do you interpret this political positioning, and what does it suggest about the limits of collective cabinet responsibility in contemporary New Zealand politics?
Yes, well, one of the things that's been really interesting in New Zealand politics since the introduction of proportional representation is the kind of changing nature of some of those conventions around cabinet collective responsibility to allow, in some instances, parties within a coalition to take different points of view, so long as it's not within the particular portfolio area of a minister. So you couldn't have a minister responsible for a particular portfolio who took a different view than cabinet on that matter. But we have seen some developments and shifts in relation to that, and that's been quite organic, and I think probably quite healthy overall. Um, I think it is interesting to see how the coalition government or the National Party would like to try and distance itself from this Treaty Principles Bill, which was very unpopular. But I think they actually need to take responsibility for giving it some life, even though they weren't going to support it through to being passed. And I think so. And to some extent, I think the statements from the Prime Minister about seeing it as divisive and not wanting it to go further are a little bit disingenuous, because he had an opportunity through the coalition negotiations to rule out this policy completely.
Mhm. So one of the one of the parliamentary haka and subsequently suspension recommendation has been characterized as both intimidating behavior and legitimate indigenous expression. How should democratic institutions balance procedural order with cultural authenticity and protest right? because that's the main issue. But they suspend the suspension, the yeah for the
Yes, yes.
MP.
One of the other kind of side issues that came out of this bill was that at its first reading, at the conclusion of the vote at the first reading, the party the Maori Party was the last party to cast their votes on this bill, and as they cast their votes, they began a haka, and many people will have seen the clip of that haka being performed, and as a result, they were referred to Parliament's Privileges Committee as the committee of Parliament which deals with these issues of order in the House, and makes recommendations about, if there's any kind of disciplinary action to follow. One of the things that's happened is that the Privileges Committee has recommended that the three Māori Party MPs who were involved in this receive very severe suspensions from Parliament. The previous uh, most severe suspension has been a suspension of 3 days, which has only ever happened before once, I think, from the Privileges Committee. And here they're recommending that two of the three MPs, the leaders of the Māori Party, the co-leaders of the Māori Party, receive suspensions of 21 days each.
Mm.
And so that's quite, that's, 7 times as long as the previous maximum suspension had been. And when you look at some of how that compares to other actions that MPs have taken, even within this parliamentary term, we've had MPs engage in uh, very intimidating conduct, both in the House and in select committees, disrupting the activities of members, fulfilling their duty. And in those other instances, the Privileges Committee hasn't recommended any suspension at all. And one of the issues that arose in this context was the Maori Party wanted to bring a kind of expert in Maori cultural practices and protocols to the Privileges Committee to talk about the haka and what it means. And part of the intent of that was to get the Privileges Committee to understand that this was not intended, well, it wasn't an intimidatory kind of action at all. It was an expression of emotion and strength of feeling about this really divisive piece of legislation. But the Privileges Committee wouldn't let them bring their expert and hear from them on that. And so what we really do have is that the Privileges Committee have applied their particular lens or understanding of what this Maori practice or expression means and looks like. And so I think many Maori I know have felt this quite personally, have seen this as a, very much an attack on Maori identity. As one of the co-leaders of the Maori Party said, they love the haka, but they don't love us. And I think many Maori felt that quite personally. And so I think it does raise the question of, how Parliament ought to better understand and appreciate Maori practices. That doesn't mean that you have to give up any kind of order and discipline in the House, and it doesn't mean you should allow people to disrupt voting or intimidate other members. But I think there is a real question of how Parliament as an institution recognises and understands Maori practices and protocols.
Yeah, I totally understand that. So New Zealand is often considered, Dr. Jones, world leader in indigenous rights. How does this controversy affect that international reputation, and what are the broader implications for this indigenous movements globally?
Yes, well, I think it does really damage New Zealand's reputation as being progressive on Indigenous rights, because this government is, through a whole range of measures, has been deliberately rolling back Maori rights, and even this instance with the haka being performed in the House and the kind of the suspensions that have been recommended. Parliament still needs to vote on those, by the way, so they haven't come into effect yet until the House votes on them. But they have been recommended by the Privileges Committee, and I think one of the concerning things in terms of the way in which New Zealand might be perceived as recognising Indigenous rights or not is that Privileges Committee recommendation was, rather than being a unanimous decision of that committee or a near unanimous decision, you had the government MPs on one side and the opposition MPs on the other side. So it does very much look like the government making this attack on Maori and on a Maori expression of protest there, which I think is quite concerning. Kind of constitutionally, of having a government effectively trying to suspend opposition MPs in that way. And I think I know from contacts that I have with other Indigenous peoples in different parts of the world that people are, watching what's going on here in Aotearoa in New Zealand, and are very, very concerned because so often there have been examples from Aotearoa that other Indigenous peoples have been able to look to or adapt or to use for their own circumstances. And to see that being rolled back, I think many Indigenous peoples around the world are thinking, well, you know, look, actually, this is how fragile our Indigenous rights are.
Yeah. So because I think this particular video footage went viral internationally. My last question to you, Dr. Jones, is looking beyond this specific controversy, what does the treaty principle bill debate reveal about the fundamental tension facing settler societies as they grapple with decolonization, multiculturalism, indigenous right in the 21st century, and what lesson might this offer for other nation facing like similar challenges?
Yes, well, I think it did really raise some of those tensions and questions around, the kind of slogans of, one law for all, and actually thinking of a much more nuanced approach to how we might better recognize everyone's rights and deliver on equity and those kinds of issues. One of the things that I think was quite a good thing to come out of the discussion that we had was that there was overwhelming opposition to this treaty principles bill. We had probably the largest march on Parliament that New Zealand has ever seen. We had nearly 300,000 submissions made to the Select Committee, which was the largest number of submissions that any bill has ever received, over three times as many as the previous number. And so that's not just Maori who were opposed and being visible and vocal in their opposition, but lots of other New Zealanders as well. And I think it did provide an opportunity to have some lots of public discussion and debate around what the Treaty of Waitangi means, what was contained in that agreement, and how we see it applying in today's context. And the Waitangi Tribunal, has done lots of work around that. Over 50 years has been addressing those questions. And so I think there was an opportunity to reflect on that work, and for many New Zealanders to actually say, we're not scared about Maori having rights and being able to exercise their rights as well. It's not going to be to the detriment of our own rights.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carwyn Jones, Honorary Adjunct Professor, School of Maori Studies at Victoria University of Wellington. What we hear today from Dr. Jones isn't just about New Zealand. It's a mirror reflecting precarious state of indigenous right worldwide. The image of Maori Party MPs performing a haka in Parliament, then facing the suspension in New Zealand history, captures something profound about the tension between cultural authenticity and the institutional power. As Dr. Jones reminds us, indigenous peoples globally are watching this unfold, understanding if New Zealand, often considered the gold standard for Indigenous right, can roll back 50 years of progress so quickly, then nowhere is truly safe. But there's hope in those 300,000 submissions, in that historic march in Parliament, in the overwhelming opposition that transcends into ethnic lines. Democracy, when activated by informed citizens, still has the power to resist. This story continues to evolve, and we'll be here to bring you the analysis that cuts through the noise. For in-depth reporting on the issue that shape our world, subscribe to readmencari.com, where we don't just report the news, we unravel the deeper currents that drive it. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next week, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, the stories that matters most are often the ones that make us most uncomfortable.